Welcome to Season 5 of the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we talk with enterprise and technology platform leaders about the people, processes, and platforms that make marketing and customer experience successful, scalable, and sustainable. This is what creates an Agile brand. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom, advisor and consultant for Fortune 1000 marketing and CX leaders and teams as principal and chief strategist at GK5A, and best-selling author, keynote speaker, entrepreneur, and Agile certified coach. The Agile Brand podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To sign up for the Agile Brand newsletter and get the latest insights and articles on marketing technology and CX, or to purchase a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, go to gregkihlstrom.com. You can also find all my books on Amazon and other retailers. And now on to the show. Today we're going to talk about inspiring innovation in ourselves and the teams we work with. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Shay Gerhardt, founder and CEO of Butterflies Technologies. Shay, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this with you. Why don't we get started by you giving a little background on yourself as well as what you're currently doing at Butterflies?
So my background, I've had 18-year career in the music, mobile, and gaming space, which has been incredibly interesting and lucky, I'd say, career.
Yeah.
And my expertise has been taking innovative product, both in digital and in hardware spaces, and going into crowded, big marketplaces and finding a path to growth successfully. So that's been my expertise throughout my career.
Yeah.
And then about 6 years ago, we started Butterflies, sort of in the same, which is an innovative earbuds company, and sort of in the same vein as taking, incredibly cool innovation that is addressing a huge need in the marketplace and finding a path to growth in a relatively crowded space.
Great. Well, so we're here to talk about innovation. You touched briefly on it already, but you're talking a little bit more about your own story with Butterflies. And so, I'm certainly not an earbud industry expert, so pardon if I ask some dumb questions here as well as we go. But also, one thing I do know, it's a fairly mature industry, and you mentioned that one of your skills and abilities is to find the gaps and things. So what led you to have an insight that could challenge some very established players in this market?
Yeah, and I've been lucky enough to be in a very innovative and up-and-coming new technology spaces in the mobile gaming space and then music mobile space. And I believe that every category is up for grabs. As long as there is a need in the marketplace for innovation, there is a big enough room for multiple players, which I think most of the cases there are. I mean, we think about some of the biggest entrepreneurial companies like Uber and Airbnb, or Uber entered into the taxi space, which was like them entering into the mob, right?
Right.
Airbnb was disrupting hospitality, which was a completely dominated marketplace and huge and established. So there's always, I think, room for innovation. And like most entrepreneurial people, I come up with, I think, new innovations all the time. But what's important to me is that there's room for huge potential and opportunity in that space. But so for Butterflies, I had, on the personal side, I had just happened to be, we're in Colorado, and I have 3 little kids. My husband, it was a powder day here. And when it's a big snow day, the traffic is terrible. So you have to wake up at like 5 a.m. to beat the traffic. So my husband was like, all right, tomorrow you go by yourself, which is like a vacation. We have little kids. And that night I was nervous I was going to miss the traffic. And so I had fallen asleep with the wired AirPods in, those white wired AirPods,
Yeah.
and woke up with crazy aching pain in my ears. And I couldn't, I mean, spending your whole, like this vacation day without having, listening to something while you're on the mountain, which I'm sure you're not supposed to do. But I was, sort of disappointed. And prior to that, I'd listened to a ton of audiobooks and podcasts. And I always say to my friends, like, hey, you did this podcast, it's super cool. And they would be like, I can't wear earbuds that long. They hurt too bad. They fall out. They cause us this like achy pain all the time. I hadn't really had that problem until this night. And so I woke up that morning and there's in the white AirPods, there's this seam down the middle where the two plastic, they call them clamshells, which I know now, but clamshell
Yeah.
parts get clipped together. So I broke open that seam, I put the components in my kid's swimmer's wax, and then wore the earbuds underneath my helmet comfortably all day. And I had
Wow.
already had achy pain in my ear. So it was incredible feeling, but also the sound environment was so much cleaner because it was like a near perfect seal in your ear.
Yeah.
And so that next Monday I'd come in and to my CFO, who was a good friend of mine at the time. And I was like, listen to what I just invented this weekend. He's like, yeah, right. That has to exist. And then we started doing a deep dive into it. And it turns out that long-term comfort and fit are the number one issues in the earbud industry. And the earbud industry is interesting because today it's a $32 billion industry, but they're projecting that in the next few years, it's going to be a $152 billion industry because
Wow.
the earbud over the watch, over the glasses is predicted to be the dominant communication and computing device of the future.
Wow.
And so it's a huge growth market. And right now, the biggest player in the market is Apple Beats, and they only own 34% of the market. The next biggest player is 11%. So essentially, that means there's roughly 66% of the market or 57% of the market up for grabs. And that's awesome. The other thing that is so interesting about this market and why this is a very attractive market is because the earbud as we know it today was invented essentially 15 years ago with the iPod and listened to and meant for only 20 minutes of music listening. The way we're using earbuds today has the content we're consuming and the way we're consuming it has changed dramatically to the point that people are using it for up to 1 to 7 hours a day. So the heavy earbud users. And so, but because there's such a huge growth in the marketplace, the big guys don't think there's much need to change because they're making a ton of money. And then the consumers when there hasn't been much change in technology change in a space, that really calls for innovation to solve for issues.
Yeah. Well, and so you mentioned the number one complaint in the industry was going essentially unsolved. I'm sure Apple and others were trying to do something to make it a little bit better or more comfortable or something like that. But still, the number one complaint in the industry was essentially meaningfully unsolved. When you came to this realization and you had this whole afternoon on the slopes and so on and so forth, how long was it since from doing that to feeling like, man, I've got something here and I've got to do something with it?
With two things. Yeah. It took us, before we launched, it took us 4 years.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But, one of the things we did is besides understanding the industry, but we wanted to understand the problem as well. So the reason that you get that achy, sore feeling or they fall out is because the human ear is constantly moving when you talk and chew and exercise. So that constant movement against that hard plastic and flexible material causes friction against your ear and causes that achy, sore feeling. The other issue is when sound vibration comes through that plastic design, it causes what's called sound fatigue in your cartilage. And then the last issue is that your ear is moving against that hard material and it causes it to walk out or fall out of your ear.
Mm.
So there's actually three things that we need to solve for when we went out in the space. So the first thing we did was validate, is this a big enough issue? Is there room in the market for us to come in and innovate? And what does the landscape look like? And so we did comprehensive studies on all of those issues and understandings and figuring out, is it possible to solve this issue? The thing that took us the longest is solving for this issue. Like, here's an anecdotal story, but I was recently talking to one of the heads of a huge headphone company. He was head of the headphone earbud division, and he's now an LP, an investor. And he was like, at our company, we spent millions and millions and had the best and the brightest working on this because we knew that comfort and fit is the golden ticket to quickly gaining ground in the marketplace. And you think about that, if the market is growing into us wearing them like wearing a watch in the future, it can't be realized without a comfortable earbud. And so that has been a very important aspect of it, but they were just thinking of it totally differently. So it took us a while, but we also wanted to make sure before we invested our time and money, before we got investment in the door, it had all the makings of a huge potential business.
Before we continue, let's take a quick break. If you're like many marketing leaders today, you're inundated with a need to improve the customer experience across an increasing number of channels and touch points, all while ensuring your team is performing well, innovating, and continuously improving. So how do you find the time to determine what's next for you, your team, your brand, and your customers? My company, GK5A, can help. Whether it is advisory services, evaluation of marketing technology platforms and solutions, or digital agencies and implementation partners, or assistance with creating strategic roadmaps and prioritization of efforts, we've done it all and served as an ally to Fortune 1000 brands in industries like financial services, healthcare, consumer electronics, professional services, and more. You can learn more about these services and contact us at www.gk5a. That's www.gk5a.com. Now let's get back to the show. In some cases, a startup doesn't have the vast resources of a large organization, of course. But do you think that the fact that you were very focused on solving this challenge, as well as perhaps more nimble than a large player in the market, even if they're established, do you think that helped you kind of get there quicker, or did it hinder you in other ways?
I think it can go both ways. I mean, I think that's why throughout American history, the business history, big industries are disrupted by outsiders.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking of it totally different than the way the old guard has always thought of things. And also because they can be more agile, right? We can change and pivot and address and fail at something, learn from it, and move on. And where a bigger company can't do that, or they don't have the teams to innovate. A lot of the big corporations out in industries are using acquisition of startups as their R&D, because they don't have that. They just don't do it in-house, which is a viable strategy and has been throughout history. But, there's other things where we don't have necessarily the buying leverage when we go in to do supply chain, and we don't have the access to all the best, whatever, engineers in the space. We do use some of the best engineers. We're using engineering firms, where everyone in our space, at least, is using the same. So we work with firms that have worked with Bose and Harvard Carbon and Apple and all those guys. So to that extent, it's sort of nice because we are getting exposed to their learnings as well.
Yeah.
And their failures, right? So.
Right. Well, it takes both, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so, you had this great idea as we were preparing for the interview here. Certainly it's not your only great idea, and but you had this great idea for this product, and it's, as you were just describing, even it's certainly not done in a vacuum. And so one of the other things I wanted to talk about was, how do you take this great idea, innovative idea, and really inspire your team and sustain that inspiration, and how do you think about that, as far as, again, spreading that enthusiasm and for innovation, and really creating something great with the rest of your team?
That's a good question. I mean, I have incredibly luck. I've been incredibly fortunate in having a team that is entrepreneurial minded, but also and takes inspiration from growing a business. And they, we were very, when vetting our team, we were very conscious to make sure they understood that this is going to be a long road and a hard one, but can be incredibly rewarding when you
Yeah.
take something from scratch and grow it into something big, and it's the coolest feeling in the world. Now, I also want to caveat that by there are plenty of people out there who aren't entrepreneurial focused, and they, do better as working in the more corporate world and space. And that is important, right? And it is
Yeah,
important
yeah,
to
it takes all
recognize
kinds.
because yeah, I mean, early on in my career, there was a few times where I had hired, the top Ivy League, the best from their jobs, and just superstars, and brought them into an entrepreneurial environment. And they, just didn't work out because they had people they wanted a team, and they needed, the assistance, and, that they wanted all the resources, which is not, that's something you just have to be super scrappy about when you're in a startup. So that is something you do have to hire for.
Yeah.
But keeping them motivated, I mean, one of the things that we are very conscious about doing is we consider every angle and thinking about in the box on every approach we do, and then what the business implications are of it. So for us, even down to manufacturing, we are doing our manufacturing so differently than anyone else in the space, and it is incredibly efficient. So we even have our founding patents around our manufacturing process because it's so innovative. And we did that mostly because we needed to be efficient on the other end, right? Like we needed our components and stuff to be efficient. And then we've also been incredibly innovative in the way we built our brand and how we talk to consumers. We make sure we do it addressing a very specific focus and vision of the brand, and never deviating from that, which is tempting because there's some standard ways to do it. So for instance, like every single earbud in the marketplace talks about music listening, and has always used music as the pinnacle of what earbuds are all about.
Yeah.
But when we did a deep dive into earbud usage, those who are heavy earbud users, they love music, but they're listening to music on their car stereos and their home stereo. When they're using their earbuds, they're using them for audiobooks, podcasts, streaming video, and phone calls. So we unapologetically say we're not about music, but we are about the spoken word and that knowledge seeker group. And so we joke that, every other brand in the space is using sexy rock stars to promote their brand. And we're using the Malcolm Gladwells of the world because his brain is what is sexy to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so again, just making sure that we're very innovative in everything we do. And I think that, I've hired a team of people that like to think differently and think outside the box. And that inspires them in itself.
And so you mentioned that the team is very focused, and yeah, I think that's a great niche to be able to focus on, and I think it can keep people aligned. How do you I guess, as CEO, how do you lead as far as making sure that people are focusing on the right things. And, if you've got a lot of entrepreneurial people, a lot of smart, creative people on the team, like how do you think about balancing innovation with consistency?
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting thing because, I mean, when you're building a brand, well, first, from that perspective, we set up our mission and vision from the very beginning,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
then each quarter, we we build our goals and our objectives, our quarterly objectives against that vision and mission and making sure we're still delivering on that. But that is a group effort. So each department has to come back and, essentially says, these are the 3 to 6 things we are going to accomplish this quarter within that vision of the company and focus. And so giving people autonomy to be able to choose exactly what projects they're going to focus on because they think that was what will affect the outcome and get us closest to that vision as possible is the best way to do it, I have found. And I also appreciate it because then we have the best thinking in the room. Like, I think the worst thing is when everyone looks, to me to answer questions or find solutions or build the strategy.
Yeah.
When I have the whole team's best thinking, that's when we get the best
Yeah.
process as possible, I guess.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, Shay, thanks so much for joining the show. I've got one last question before we wrap up here. What for those potential entrepreneurs out there, they've got a great idea or two, and maybe not sure if it's time for them to pursue it. What would your advice be for them to, uh, you know, determine if it's the right time to make a move and really capitalize on an idea?
I mean, I think there's two things you should consider in that. I mean, one is the personal. Running a company is not for the faint of heart. It is
Right.
takes a ton of mental gymnastics, and it is a lot of work. It's really incredibly rewarding, but it's not like you take a vacation and
Yeah.
unless you're incredibly skilled. So I would say just make sure you're in the right mental space. Also, you probably won't make as much, as you used to. So just make sure you're also as a financial position to do it.
Yeah.
But if you have that type of mindset, I think you can't. It's the coolest thing you'll ever do. From a professional standpoint. Like
Yeah.
on the flip side, if you have a really cool idea that you think has a ton of potential, I mean, one of the things I always recommend to people is Bill Lyett from MIT has a book called The Disciplined Entrepreneur. And that book goes through a step-by-step process. It's focused on the digital side of things versus hardware, but it is incredibly helpful. And I think every entrepreneur should absolutely do that before they start a business, because what it helps you go through is thinking of, even if it's a brilliant idea, and a lot of times the traps we get in is that, it's hard to think outside of what our world is. So something we would really could use, but does it have a big enough market? People may say they love it, but are they willing to pay for it? So things
Yeah.
that we did early on was we would buy media. So we would buy $10,000 worth of media, actually sell the product. And we also have a digital aspect to our product. So we would sell the digital aspect and then we would return it and say it's not available, but keep you in touch to return their money. But that is a huge proof point that people are willing to put their credit card down and pay for what you're offering. That is where the proof is in the pudding. If you're doing B2B, sort of stuff, actually talk to your end customer, get them to sign an LOI or whatever it is, so that you actually can see, okay, this is a viable business. And you can do all the quantitative research you want, but until you actually get someone to sign on that dotted line, that's when the proof is in the pudding starts to be, right?
Yeah.
So I think those types of steps are really important because there's a lot of fantastic entrepreneurial stories out there that are the success stories, but you do have to think like 97% of entrepreneurial businesses are failing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So be in it for the learning. That's the other thing I'd say is like every day there are times where I had to check myself, like get out of bed, like, okay, if I could do anything else in the world, what would I do? And it always comes back to like, this is exactly what I would do. It's so interesting every day. Growing a business is incredibly rewarding.
Nice. Yeah, wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Shay Gerhardt, founder and CEO of Butterflies Technologies, for joining the show. You can learn more about Shay and Butterflies by following the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.gregkihlstrom.com. That's GregKihlstrom.com. To get a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, visit my website, or you can find it on Amazon or other retailers. The Agile Brand is produced by Missing Link, a Latina-owned, strategy-driven, creatively fueled production co-op. From ideation to creation, they craft human connections through intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Until next time, stay agile.